I'm very honored to be here speaking this morning, and I wanted to start with a few thoughts that I've had even in the last hour as I kind of walked around and tried to make sense of enjoyed hearing some of the early speakers and trying to kind of set in my head the multiple goals that this conference has. Wrestling with peoplehood is a very broad topic, and I think peoplehood itself is a topic that has lots of possible meanings. And I think that's both the real strength of this conference and also something that might be helpful at the very beginning to kind of tease out what peoplehood means and what we're talking about, and as kind of a guide for the next 2 days. I think there are at least 3 ways that I can think of that we're dealing with peoplehood today, and in general we use the term. The first is there's this historical concept, which is a relatively new concept of Jewish peoplehood. It doesn't mean that Jews haven't been talking about collectivity for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it does mean this very specific term, which I will talk about for most of my comments today, is a relatively new concept. It's associated with Kaplan. It's very much part of his legacy, and it's not a coincidence that the Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood includes peoplehood as part of the definition. The second part of peoplehood is the way that the term has, especially over the last, I'd say, 10 years, has really, there's been a renaissance of use of this term. You see peoplehood commissions, you see educational organizations, you see the Diaspora Museum in Israel that has changed its name to the Museum of the Jewish People. There is clearly a push, and we can talk during the conference where that's coming from and why, but there is clearly an interest in this term, in peoplehood. There's now a new term that's been introduced in, that's the irony of always happens, right? I remind students and it's my cell phone that goes off. Then there is also in Israel this Museum of the Jewish People. So there is a lot of interest in promoting this term among some institutions in the United States and in Israel. And the final piece that I think thread that comes through this conference, especially in the number of practitioners that are in this room and will be speaking, is the ways in which Jews today are thinking about collectivity, diversity, boundaries, and the way in which Jews construct Jewish collectivity and how we promote connections among Jews. These 3 ways of thinking about peoplehood as a historical context, as a contemporary kind of rhetoric that's at the center of institutional Jewish life, and the various expressions of collectivity that practitioners are taking part in are all part of this conversation. And I think it's important to at least be aware that we may be talking about different things, or to be aware that there are 3 different contexts for thinking about peoplehood. So my goal for my comments this morning, and this comes from a book that I recently published called Jewish Peoplehood and American Innovation, is to look a little bit at the historical context and how the historical notion of peoplehood is still being used in some of this contemporary discussion of the concept. When I started working on this book project to trace the origins of Jewish peoplehood, I just discovered a very nifty tool on Google. It's called Ngram. I don't know if anybody's ever used it, but Google, in their infinite wisdom or attempts to take over all of the knowledge in the world, has scanned millions and millions of books. And if you go to Google Ngram, you can actually look for terms, any term, and it will show you a chart that says in a particular year how many books that were published in that year use that term. And when you look for Jewish peoplehood, or peoplehood, by the way, you see a dramatic chart. The chart starts 1880s, let's say, and the numbers are basically flat, all the way until 1942. In 1942, you see a little bit of an increase, and in 1948, it goes off the charts. And then it kind of continues to rise over time. So looking at that, I thought to myself, this really is a totally new word. Now, sometimes new words are just translations of old concepts, but as somebody who's interested in how words operate, I think it's significant that it's a new word, because new words usually represent radically new ideas and new ways of thinking about the world. The challenge when you come across something like that Ngram viewer is you don't always know, well, what the heck happened in 1942? Like, where did this word come from? So I spent some time doing some research. There were a few early mentions of the term, But I think I was able to pinpoint a crucial moment in the evolution of Jewish peoplehood. And there's a surprising element and an unsurprising element about where I found it. The unsurprising element is that it can be traced to Mordecai Kaplan. The surprising element is it wasn't an idea that he was interested in using. It wasn't the word that he was supporting. It wasn't a term that, at least according to the sources that I found, he even thought of initially as this concept. There are the SAJ papers, which newsletter, which was when Kaplan was, the Reconstructionist movement was developing at the Society for Advancement of Judaism. There was a newsletter that was published, and apparently there was a conference in the summer of 1942. And the newsletter reports that at this conference, Mordecai Kaplan gave a talk, and his talk was parsing the meaning of Jewish nationalism and nationhood. And in 1942, Kaplan was trying to figure out whether Jews were a nation, a nationality, or the term nationhood was the best way of referring to Jews. Were Jews nation, nationality, or nationhood? And it was really interesting to see him struggling with these different terms, why it's a nation, why nationality is the best term, why nationhood. And then the report continues, and it turns out that some of the people just in the audience said, Professor Kaplan, Rabbi Kaplan, not Rabbiton Kaplan, Rabbi Kaplan most likely, Rabbi Kaplan, what are you doing with these words? Nationality, nationhood, nation, these words, you can't use these words anymore. Let me throw out some suggestions. And the suggestions, and you can see these in this newsletter, were nationalityhood, religious nationalism, and peoplehood. Now, somebody who was sitting in a room in 1942 would have thought that peoplehood sounded just as weird and confusing as nationalityhood. It wasn't a term. Remember that engram? Nobody used this term peoplehood before. And in fact, Kaplan, as far as I've been able to find, and I'm here with people like Mel Skolt in this room, and Dan and others who have a tremendous background in Kaplan. Maybe you can point to earlier incidences. But in terms of what I've found, before 1942, Kaplan talked about Jews as a nation, as a national group. He does not talk about Jews in the terminology of peoplehood. And when this term is thrown out by one of the people in the room, we don't know how Kaplan responded. But we do know that starting in the next issue of the Reconstructionist magazine that Kaplan was writing for, he starts using the term peoplehood. His students start using the term peoplehood. And at that point in 1942, the term really takes off, especially after the publication of after his publications of subsequent books that use the term peoplehood. So why is this significant? Why is it significant? It's significant because the concept of Jewish peoplehood is really Kaplan's concept of Jewish nationalism. And the concept of Jewish nationalism is something that Kaplan spent most of his career, and you have to remember by the 1940s, Kaplan is already way into his career, right? He's in his 60s already, was focused on the question of Jewish nationalism and Zionism. And he was struggling with the definition of Jewish nationalism as it was developing. He had criticisms of the way in which Zionism was very much focused on the creation of a political state, and he really thought that the idea of nationalism that he wanted to see, not only for the Jews, but more generally, was an idea of nationalism that promoted toleration and pluralism rather than political sovereignty in a homogeneous ethno-national state. Because he was concerned, given what he saw in Europe, that nationalism was bound to lead to chauvinism and to strife between different ethnic groups, and Jewish nationalism was the antidote to what he saw as the nationalisms that were developing in the 30s and 40s in Europe. So he really saw this from the perspective of Jews as a minority group in a nation state, rather than Jews as the majority. But something happened in the 1940s, which is that you no longer could debate about the meaning of nationalism. It was pretty much fixed to be what it still means to this day, which is a group that has a state. That's how you think about nationalism. National groups, they should have states. That wasn't Kaplan's vision. So the importance of the fact that it comes from nationalism is that nationalism is a very new concept in how Jews think about themselves. And there are four major areas that are crucial for Kaplan's notion of nationhood, which then shape his notion of peoplehood, and I would say all of our understanding of peoplehood towards today. The first is political unity, the notion of unity. That collectivity is all about unity. Remember, nations were trying to argue that they had a shared political voice, and so political unity was important. Second, there was a homeland, so even though Kaplan was critical of aspects of Zionism, he deeply believed in the centrality of the homeland. Third, that there is a national history, and that is a history of Jews descendant from one another. So if you think about the Germans, how they came up with the idea of being going back, they could trace their historical lineage, or the French, right? National groups have national histories. They're usually secular. And the key to a national history, and this is the fourth point, is that it usually articulates what is the unique mission or contribution of this national group. And for Kaplan, the Jewish contribution was this idea of a shared ethical vision, especially around questions of politics. So the four key areas are political unity, homeland as central, a national history based on the descent of Jews from one to another all the way back to Moses, and a shared mission. So Jewish peoplehood is obviously has pre-modern basis in terms of notions of Am Yisrael, of thinking about Jews as having collective, but the modern notion of peoplehood is basically a version. It puts Jewish collectivity into the mold of nationalism by focusing on the idea of unity, the idea of a national history, and the idea of a shared ethical mission. And I think that those ideas have continued to inform all of American Judaism in terms of what it means to be collective to this day. And one of the challenges that we have today is that those ideas about nationalism are precisely the ideas that younger generations of Jews, and even some, it's not only generational, I think there are trends, but the current trends in thinking about ethnicity and nationality and diaspora all go radically against those concepts of collectivity built on ideas of political unity, of a statist homeland, of a national history based on descent, and of a shared ethical mission. If you think about, for example, just the idea of being descendant as creating boundaries between one group and another, descent, that consent, the voluntary decision is much more important than who your parents are, as one example. Or the challenge of articulating one ethical shared mission that all Jews share. The goal of nationalism was to articulate the lowest common denominator to create Jewish unity. And I guess what I question today is, I have 5 more minutes? Oh, I can slow down a little. How do I do this? So the basis of nationalism, those concepts are ones that go directly opposed to some of the key concepts in how we think about identity today and some of the realities of American Jewish life and American life today. And that leaves those interested in Jewish peoplehood and Jewish collectivity 3 different options. The first is to completely reject everything I just said and to argue that Jewish peoplehood, as it's articulated in supporting the state of Israel, in this shared Jewish history, in the importance of in-marriage and descent, and the idea that all Jews, no matter how different they look, all share the same ethical mission, and there is a lowest common denominator that Jews can rally around and be unified around. Then you reject what Rebbitzin professor Noam Pianko just said, and you basically say, like, we're going to double down on that model, that it isn't a model that was developed in the 1920s and 30s to meet the needs of a certain moment in history, but instead that there is something eternal about this notion of Jewish peoplehood being central. The second thing that you can do is you can kind of throw peoplehood to the wind and say, hey, if what Professor Pianko just said is that peoplehood is a construction of somebody named Mordecai Kaplan and his disciples in a room, and not even the term that this man actually wants to be remembered for. He as late as his publication of the New Zionism, said that he's only using peoplehood for until there can be a conference of leaders in place who will come up with a better term. He did not want that to be his legacy. It became his legacy, but I don't think he wanted it to be his legacy necessarily. And so he himself didn't love the term. It was kind of a term that he was backed into. It's a term meant for a certain place. It was invented, constructed. Why do we care about it anymore? It's a new concept. We should just throw it out. The last possibility is to recalibrate this notion of Jewish peoplehood, is to recognize that the notion of Jewish peoplehood that we've inherited was ideally suited for a moment in Jewish history when American Jews needed to figure out a language to rally around the Jews who were in need in Europe and to support the fledgling Zionist entity in the homeland, and they needed a compromised language. People had fulfilled that language. It allowed Jews to be secular. It allowed Jews to come up with a language for articulating what was unique about them, but it is not well suited for today. And the challenge of our generation is to rethink the concept of peoplehood. And I will throw out three concepts that I go in much more depth in my book plug, Jewish Peoplehood and American Innovation, available on Amazon.
It's available for sale.
But here are the three. I'll throw them out, and then we can either talk more in the questions, or I'm happy to talk afterwards. The first is to focus on neighborhoods, not nationhood. And here, there is why is unity so central to collectivity? That's because of modern nationalism. It doesn't have to be. And what would it look like to think about building Jewish collectivity on a neighborhood model, not a national model? The second is not looking at who you are, your essence, who you're descendant from, but what you do. So it would be a project rather than something that exists and create boundaries. And the borders would be more fluid, but it would be about what you do, not what you are, who you're descendant from. And the final one is actually to take Judaism from the adjective that describes this collective group, Jewish peoplehood, Jewish people, German people, French people, it's an adjective, to actually thinking about Jewishness. Jewishness, Judaism, in the multiple ways that you can think about it, is really left out of the modern conceptions of peoplehood because it's very difficult to argue about unity when you're debating about what Judaism is. But I think we need to put the Jewish back into Jewish peoplehood in a sense, and it's very important not to focus on that Jews are connected, but what it is that actually connects Jews. And it doesn't have to be the same. It's not one Judaism. It's just the process of engaging. So I will end there, and I'm happy to continue the conversation. I'm looking forward to my co-panelists. Thank you.